You think people like you get to say no. Derek Vaughn's voice cut through the cafe like a blade. His hand locked around Emma's wrist, squeezing until her fingers went white. The coffee pot she'd been holding clattered to the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 12 customers sat frozen in their booths, staring at their plates, praying not to be noticed. And behind the counter, an old man in a stained apron stood completely still, watching. Not afraid, not helpless, waiting. Like a man who had been through enough storms to know exactly when one was about to break. If this kind of story speaks to something in you, the idea that quiet people sometimes carry the loudest thunder, hit subscribe right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Desert Rose Cafe had been sitting beside that forgotten stretch of Arizona highway for 31 years. And in all that time, the highway had never been kind to the people who worked there. It baked them in summer. It isolated them in winter. It sent them the kind of customers who treated a roadside diner like a place where the rules of ordinary decency didn't apply because nobody important was watching and nothing out here really mattered. Emma Carter had been working the morning shift since she was 19. She was 24 now, and in 5 years she had learned the specific weight of every kind of tired a person could carry. The tired that came from being on your feet for 10 hours. The tired that came from smiling at strangers when you had no reason to smile. The tired that came from lying awake at 3 in the morning, doing math in your head, adding up tips, subtracting bills, calculating how many more months you could hold on before the whole thing collapsed underneath you. She'd learned all of those kinds of tired. She'd made peace with most of them. What she hadn't made peace with was losing her father. 6 months ago, Daniel Carter had died in a Phoenix hospital bed after a year and a half of fighting a heart condition that the doctors always described in careful clinical language that basically translated to expensive, slow, and losing. Emma had driven back and forth to Phoenix 93 times during that year and a half. She'd sold her car after visit number 40 to pay for the medication. She took the bus after that, which added 3 hours each way and meant she often arrived at the hospital already exhausted, already hollowed out, already using everything she had, just to walk through the door with a steady face so her father wouldn't see how frightened she was. Daniel Carter had been a quiet man, a man who fixed things. Not because he was a repairman, he'd spent most of his working life driving a delivery truck, but because fixing things was simply how he expressed love. If something was broken in your life, Daniel Carter's first instinct was to roll up his sleeves and find the problem and work on it until it was solved or he was too tired to continue. Emma had watched him do this her entire childhood. She understood now that he was gone, that the man had basically spent his whole life pouring himself into other people until there was nothing left to pour. He'd left her one thing in his will, a small silver necklace with a desert flower pendant, the same one he'd bought her mother the summer they'd met before her mother died when Emma was 11. He'd kept it in the top drawer of his nightstand for 13 years. When he pressed it into her hand 3 days before he died, he couldn't speak very well anymore, but his eyes said everything clearly. He wanted her to have something that connected them all three together. Him, her mother, and her. Emma wore it every single day. She was wearing it on the afternoon Derek Vaughn walked through the door. She noticed them immediately, not because they were loud, though they were, but because of the way they moved. There were 5 of them. Derek was in front, and he had the particular walk of a man who had never been told no in an environment where the consequences were real. A man who'd learned at some point that she and confidence and a willingness to go further than anyone else expected could substitute for almost anything. Intelligence, decency, patience. He wore it like a uniform. He slid into the corner booth without asking. The 4 men with him spread out, 1 at the counter, 2 at a table near the door, 1 leaning against the wall beside the restrooms. Emma recognized it even if she couldn't have named the pattern. They were covering the room. She picked up her order pad and walked over. "What can I get you?" Derek looked her up and down slowly. Not the way men sometimes looked at her. She'd developed a thick skin about that over the years, but differently. Evaluating, like she was inventory. "Coffee," he said, "and I want to talk to whoever's in charge." "That would be Mr. Mitchell. He's in the back. I'll let him know you're asking." "No," Derek said. "I'll tell you what I need and you can pass it along. That's how this is going to work." Emma kept her voice level. "Okay, what do you need?" Derek leaned back in the booth and folded his hands on the table. He had a ring on his right hand, thick silver, some kind of emblem on it that she couldn't make out clearly. His nails were clean. She noticed that specifically because it struck her as deliberate. This was not a man who had gotten his hands dirty doing honest work. This was a man who had paid other people to do that. We provide a service to businesses along this stretch of highway, he said. Protection. Keeps the troublemakers away. Keeps operations running smooth. The arrangement is $500 a week, paid every Friday. Emma stared at him. That's not something we're interested in. Derek smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. See, that's a funny answer because it's not really something you opt into or out of. It's more like a utility, water, electricity. You don't opt out of those either. We don't have $500 a week, Emma said, which was true. And even if we did, the answer would be no. The smile stayed. Then I'd suggest you talk to Mr. Mitchell, because the last business owner who gave me that answer had a kitchen fire the following week. Strange how that happens. Emma's jaw tightened. She wrote nothing on her order pad. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll bring you the coffee, she said. She walked back behind the counter and pushed through the kitchen door and stood for a second in the narrow space between the prep table and the refrigerator, controlling her breathing, getting her heart rate down. Through the pass-through window, she could see Derek watching her. His men were casual, relaxed, the way people get when they've done the same thing so many times it's lost its texture. She knocked on Jack's office door. No. Jack Mitchell was 62 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had been in a few arguments with the world, not lost exactly, but definitely marked. He was lean in the way that some older men got lean, not from exercise, but from a certain quality of alertness, a body that had never fully learned how to relax. His hair was white at the temples and gray everywhere else. He had deep-set eyes the color of old denim, and when he turned those eyes on you, you had the sense that he was not just looking at your face. I was reading you. He'd been going over invoices when Emma knocked. He put down his pen immediately. Come in. Emma opened the door and stood in the doorway. There are 5 men in the booth by the window, she said quietly. The one in front said they provide protection services. He wants $500 a week. Jack's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes, subtle, like a door closing softly in a room far away. What did you tell him? I told him no. Good. He reached for his pen again. Emma stared at him. Jack, he threatened us. He said the last person who refused had a kitchen fire. That's all you've got. Jack looked up at her. His voice was even. Go take their order. If they want coffee, give them coffee. Charge them for it. They'll leave eventually. And when they come back, we'll handle it. How by calling the sheriff out here barely. Emma, he said her name quietly, and then there was something in the way he said it that stopped her mid-sentence. Not authority exactly. Something older than authority. Go take their order. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back out to the floor. She brought Derek his coffee. He watched her pour it without saying anything. Then when she set the pot down, Friday, he said. I heard you the first time, Emma said. He smiled again. She walked away. That was the first Tuesday in October. By the following Friday, she understood that Jack had been wrong about one thing. They didn't leave eventually. They came back. Derek returned with only 2 men that time, but the message was different. He didn't sit down. He walked straight to the counter, placed both palms flat on the surface, and looked Emma dead in the eyes. I'm going to make this simple, he said. 500, now, or this stops being a conversation. Emma was alone on the floor. It was mid-afternoon, the lull between the lunch crowd and the evening truckers, and there were only 2 other customers, an elderly couple in the far booth who had stopped eating and were sitting very still with their eyes down. Mr. Mitchell isn't here right now, Emma said. I know he isn't, Derek said. That's why I'm here now. He said it like it was obvious, like he'd timed it, and she realized then that he probably had. I don't have access to that kind of money, Emma said. Then open the register and give me what's in it, and we'll call the difference a down payment. Emma felt her hands go cold. The register had $240 in it. That was it. That was the whole afternoon's take plus the 20 Emma kept as a float at the start of every shift. If he took it, she couldn't make change for the rest of the day. If she couldn't make change, she'd have to close early. If she closed early, she lost whatever the evening truckers would have brought in. She could feel the math collapsing. No, she said. Derek reached across the counter and grabbed her wrist. His grip was hard. Not the exploratory grip of a man testing limits, the grip of a man who had already decided. You think people like you get to say no? The elderly couple in the far booth stood up very quickly and went out the front door, leaving half a plate of food behind. Emma heard the bell above the door chime and then fade. The two men with Derek had spread out again, one on each side, blocking the counter from either direction. Emma did not scream. She didn't know exactly why fear maybe, or the specific quality of stubbornness her father had always called her best and worst quality simultaneously. She just looked at Derek's hand on her wrist and then looked at his face. "Let go of me," she said. Derek tilted his head slightly, like the words surprised him. Like they were an unusual configuration of sounds to hear in this context. Then the kitchen door opened. Jack came through without hurrying. He had a dish towel over one shoulder and a coffee mug in his hand, and he looked like a man who had walked out of a kitchen 1,000 times before. He took in the scene, Derek's hand on Emma's wrist, the two men by the counter, the empty dining room, and he stopped. He didn't move fast. He didn't raise his voice. He set his coffee mug down on the counter very carefully, the way you set something down when you want the action to be noticed. "Let her go," he said. Derek turned. He looked Jack up and down, the old man in the apron, the dish towel, the gray hair, and something dismissive settled into his expression. He let Emma go, not because Jack had asked, because he had decided he could afford to. "You must be Mitchell," Derek said. "I am." "Good, then we can skip the middle part." Derek straightened up, rolled his neck. "500 a week, starting now, that's the arrangement." "No," Jack said. "Well," Derek stared at him. "You're serious." "Always." The two men by the counter shifted slightly, not moving yet, but repositioning. Emma saw it. She moved back a step without meaning to, her wrist still aching where Derek had gripped it. Derek walked toward Jack, slowly stopping about 3 feet away. He was taller than Jack by a couple of inches and broader by quite a bit, and he used all of it consciously, squaring up so that the size differential was maximally legible. "Old man," he said, "I want you to think carefully about what you're doing here." Jack looked at him. Just looked at him. For about 3 seconds, nobody in the room moved or spoke. Then Jack picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "I've thought about it," he said. The answer's still no. Derek's jaw tightened. He glanced at his men, a quick check, the kind that happened when someone was deciding how far to escalate, and then looked back at Jack. "You're going to regret that," he said. "Probably not," Jack said. Derek turned and walked out. His men followed. The bell above the door chimed again. Emma stood behind the counter, her heart loud in her chest, watching them go. She turned to look at Jack. He had picked up his dish towel and was already turning back toward the kitchen. "Jack," he stopped. "What was that?" she asked. "Why weren't you scared?" He considered the question. Not dismissively, actually considered it like it deserved a real answer. "Because I've met a lot of men like that," he said, "and I know what they are." "What are they?" He pushed through the kitchen door. "Small," he said, "just very loud." The weeks that followed were not loud. That was the worst part. Derek had learned something from the first 2 visits, and he applied it with the particular intelligence of a man who had spent years doing this kind of work. He didn't come back himself. He sent messages instead. The first message came the following Monday. Emma arrived to open the cafe at 5:30 in the morning and found both front tires of Jack's truck flattened, a specific and deliberate act of inconvenience rather than destruction. A warning, not a punishment, not yet. She stood there in the pre-dawn dark looking at the tires and felt the specific fear that comes not from an immediate threat, but from the recognition that someone is working through a plan, that there's a sequence, that you're already inside it and you don't know how many steps are left. She called Jack. He came changed, the tire said very little. His expression was the same controlled flatness it had been in the cafe. She could not tell if he was angry or indifferent or something else entirely, and that uncertainty disturbed her more than the tires. The second message came the following Thursday. A regular customer, Dave Kimura, a long-haul trucker who stopped at the Desert Rose every Thursday for biscuits and gravy and black coffee, had been coming for 6 years, came in looking rattled. He sat in his usual booth but didn't order right away. When Emma came over, he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was an apology before he'd said anything. "Emma," he said, "I can't come back here after today." She kept her voice steady. Did someone talk to you? He looked at his hands. A guy at the way station said the places he eats at are his business and people who eat at problem places have problem lives. He paused. I got a wife and 2 kids. I can't afford problem lives. Emma understood. She brought him his biscuits and gravy and black coffee and refused to charge him for it. He sat there eating for 20 minutes, looking guilty the whole time, and then left and didn't come back. It was the same with others. Slowly over the following week, the morning crowd thinned, then the lunch crowd. The regulars who had been reliable fixtures for years started finding reasons to stop elsewhere. Nothing dramatic, no confrontations, no scenes. They just didn't come. Revenue dropped 30% in 2 weeks. Emma did the math every night. She knew exactly how many weeks she could sustain a 30% drop before the numbers stopped working. She knew it the way you know the balance of your last bank account before everything runs out precisely, painfully, and without any illusions about what it meant. She told Jack. He listened. He looked at the numbers she'd written on a notepad. He nodded slowly. He's patient, Jack said mostly to himself. Patience isn't what I'm worried about, Emma said. What I'm worried about is next month. Jack folded the notepad and handed it back to her. Keep tracking. Don't panic. Don't give him anything. Jack. She heard the frustration break through into her voice despite herself. You could stop this. I don't know how, but I know you could. Why won't you? He stood up and walked to the window of his office. There was a leather jacket hanging on a hook on the back of the door. She'd noticed it before, old, heavy black, but never paid it much attention. He looked at it for a moment. There are things I could do, he said, and I've done them before, and every single time I told myself it was for the right reason. He paused. I'm not sure I trust my own reasons anymore. Emma stared at him. What does that mean? He turned from the window. It means I'm trying to handle this a different way. The different way isn't working. Not yet, he said. Give it time. She gave it time. It took Derek 11 days to run out of patience. He came at night not to the cafe itself, but to the back parking lot where Emma parked her bicycle. She'd been closing up alone that night because Jack had driven into town to meet with an insurance adjuster about the cafe's policy renewal, a meeting that in retrospect felt deliberate, timed, arranged. She'd finished counting the drawer, turned off the lights, locked the front door, walked around to the back. Derek was there with 2 men she hadn't seen before, bigger than the ones from before, standing between her and her bicycle. Emma, Derek said, we need to settle up. She felt the ground shift under her, not literally, but the way the world rearranges itself when you understand that you're in a situation you can't talk yourself out of. Her phone was in her apron pocket. Her apron was on a hook inside the kitchen. Mr. Mitchell handles the finances, she said. Mitchell isn't here, Derek said, and there it was again, the same timing, the same premeditation. And we're not talking about Mitchell's money tonight. We're talking about yours. She understood before he moved. She took a step back and he covered the distance in 2 steps and grabbed her by the arm. Not her wrist this time, her whole forearm, both hands solid and deliberate. You've been very brave, he said. That's cute, but brave doesn't pay what you owe me. He reached into her apron. Not her apron. He reached into her jacket pocket where she'd put the cash she'd saved separately. $180 she'd been setting aside for the last installment of her father's medical bill. She'd been putting it off for weeks, adding to the envelope, trying to get to $200 before she paid. He took the envelope. She tried to pull her arm free. He tightened his grip and shoved her back against the wall of the cafe, not violently enough to injure, but hard enough to make the point without any ambiguity whatsoever. This is a down payment, he said. Then one of the men stepped forward and held up a photograph. Just held it up in the air the way you'd hold up evidence. It was a photograph that had been sitting on the shelf behind the counter inside the cafe, a framed photo of Emma with her parents taken when she was 9 years old at some kind of picnic, her mother laughing, her father squinting happily against the sun, Emma in the middle, small and delighted. The man dropped the photograph on the ground. The glass cracked against the concrete. Next time we come, Derek said, we won't be this polite. He released her arm. They walked away. Emma stood against the wall of the cafe in the dark for a long time. She looked at the cracked photograph on the ground. She bent down and picked it up carefully, holding the frame so the broken glass didn't fall. She looked at her mother's laughing face and her father's squinting happy face and her own small 9-year-old face in the middle. She put it inside her jacket against her chest and held it there with one hand while she called Jack with the other. He arrived in 8 minutes. He took in the parking lot, took in the crack in the frame, took in the envelope that was no longer in Emma's pocket. He didn't ask many questions. He stood very still for a moment, looking at the concrete where the photograph had fallen. Then he looked at Emma. She had held herself together completely from the moment she'd picked up the phone until that exact moment. His eyes meeting hers, the specific quality of attention in them. The silence that asked nothing and somehow gave her permission to fall apart just slightly, just at the edges. "He took the money for my dad's bill," she said. Jack looked at her for a long moment. "I know." "And the photograph, I know." His voice hadn't changed. The flatness was still there, but something behind it had shifted. She couldn't explain it exactly. It was the difference between a dial set at 0 and a dial that had been moved to 0 from somewhere much higher. The position was the same. The tension in it was not. "Jack," she said, "what are you going to do?" He looked at the space where the men had been standing. His face was composed and still. "Something I should have done sooner," he said. He took the cracked photograph frame gently from her hands. He looked at it for a moment at Daniel Carter's squinting, happy face at the bright Arizona sun in the background. "Go inside," he said. "Lock the doors. Don't open them until I call you." "Jack." "Emma." He said her name the same way he'd said it before. "Please." She went inside. She locked the doors. She stood at the window in the dark and watched him walk to his office. She saw the light click on. She saw his shadow move across the frosted glass of the door. She watched the shadow stop. She watched it reach for something on the wall. She watched it lift the leather jacket from the hook. And she understood, standing there in the dark cafe with the cracked photograph pressed against her chest, that the man she had known for 5 years, the quiet old cafe owner with the dish towel and the patient eyes, was not the whole truth of who Jack Mitchell was. She just didn't know yet what the rest of that truth looked like. She was about to find out. She didn't sleep that night. She tried. She lay on the narrow cot in the back storage room, the one Jack had set up years ago for nights when the weather was too bad to drive home, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence of the highway and thought about her father's face in that photograph. The cracked glip, yes. The way Derek had dropped it without looking at it, the way you drop something that has no value to you purely to demonstrate that you understand exactly what it has to you. That was the part that kept her awake. Not the money, though the money was gone, and she needed it. Not the fear, though the fear was real, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. It was the deliberateness of it, the knowledge behind it. Derek had looked around the cafe at some point, maybe the very first day, maybe later, and he had clocked what mattered to her. He had done the same calculation a predator always does, find the soft place, apply pressure there. He'd chosen her father's photograph. She pressed the cracked frame against her chest in the dark and didn't cry, because she'd used up that particular resource a long time ago, and her body had learned to process grief without it. But she felt the weight of the frame against her sternum, and she thought, "Dad, I don't know what to do." The light in Jack's office stayed on until 2 in the morning. She knew because she watched the thin line of gold under the door for hours listening. She couldn't hear anything through the walls, no phone calls, no movement, no voice. Just the light, just the fact that Jack Mitchell was sitting in that office awake in the dark of the highway night, doing something she couldn't see or name. At 2:15, the light went off. At 5, she got up and started the coffee. Jack came out of his office at 5:45, looking exactly the same as he always did. Clean shirt, same worn jeans, hair combed back. He poured himself a cup from the pot she'd made and stood at the counter drinking it and looking out at the highway through the front windows. The early morning light was just starting to come up, pale and thin, the way it did in October out here, when the heat had finally broken and the desert remembered how to be cold. Emma stood across this counter from him and waited. He drank half the cup before he spoke. "How's your arm?" She'd forgotten about her arm. She looked at it. There was bruising along the end of her forearm where Derek had grabbed her, not dramatic bruising, the kind that shows up purple and yellow, but the kind that's just there, present a dull ache when she rotated her wrist. "Fine," she said. Jack looked at it for a moment. "It's not fine," he said. "I've had worse." "I know, that doesn't make this fine." He set down his cup. "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly." "Okay." "Are you scared?" She held his gaze. Yes. Good, he said, which was not what she expected. Scared means you're paying attention. Scared means your instincts are working. He picked up his cup again. People who stop being scared in situations like this are the ones who get hurt. Jack, what did you do last night in your office? He looked at the highway. Made some calls, he said. To who? He didn't answer immediately. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the sink, and turned to face her with his hands on the edge of the counter. His expression had the specific quality of a man organizing what he's willing to say and what he's not. People I haven't talked to in a while, he said. People who should know what's happening here. Why, who are they? Nobody you need to worry about yet. She felt the frustration rise up again. The same frustration from every conversation she'd had with him about this, the sense of being kept 2 steps behind the facts on purpose. Jack, I work here. I live here, basically. I'm the one Derek grabbed last night. I think I'm past the point where you get to decide what I need to worry about. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite apology, but close. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that she was right. Okay, he said. Okay, fair. You're right. He paused. I reached out to some people who know Derek Vaughn, know his operation, know what he's done along this highway and how long he's been doing it. What kind of people? The kind who don't generally talk to law enforcement, Jack said. The kind who have their own ways of tracking situations like this. Emma stared at him. You're not a cafe owner, she said. I mean you are. But that's not all you are, is it? It wasn't a question. He'd stopped fooling her 2 sentences ago. Jack looked at her for a long time. It's mostly what I am, he said, anymore. But before, he turned and walked back toward his office. She thought he was going to close the door and end the conversation. Instead, he stopped in the doorway with his back to her. Before, he said, I was something else. And it's because of what I was before that I know how to handle what Derek Vaughn is. He turned his head slightly, not quite looking at her. I need you to trust me a little longer. I've been trusting you. I know, a little longer. He went into his office. He didn't close the door all the way. Emma stood at the counter with her coffee and thought about the leather jacket she'd watched his shadow lift from the hook. She hadn't seen it on the hook this morning. Hadn't seen it anywhere in the office when she glanced through the half-open door. She didn't ask about it. Derek did not come back for 6 days. Those 6 days were the quietest and the worst. The revenue kept dropping. 2 more regulars stopped coming, including Harriet Cole, a retired teacher who'd been eating breakfast at the Desert Rose every weekday morning for 4 years and always left a $2 tip on a $7 order, and told Emma she reminded her of her own daughter. Harriet came in on a Tuesday, sat in her usual seat, ordered her usual eggs, and then, halfway through the meal, she leaned forward and said quietly, Emma, I'm so sorry, I can't, and then stopped. Her hands were shaking. It's okay, Harriet, Emma said. It's not okay, Harriet said. It's very far from okay, but I have a bad heart, honey, and I can't afford the stress. She paid for her eggs and left, and Emma watched the door close behind her and felt the specific ache of something she couldn't name. Not anger, not sadness exactly, but something adjacent to both. The feeling of watching a community get frightened apart piece by piece, person by person, until all that's left is the space where it used to be. She told Jack that evening. He listened with his eyes on the counter. He's good at this, Jack said. Terrifying people, yeah, he's excellent at it. No, Jack said, at calculating pressure, at knowing exactly how much to apply and where. He's done this before. Many times, he paused. He's doing what he always does. He doesn't break things right away. He makes the air around them unbreathable until they fall apart on their own. Emma looked at him. How do you know all that? Because I made some more calls. Jack. Emma. He looked up at her. I have a plan. I need you to understand that. What I don't want is for you to do anything on your own between now and when it plays out. Don't confront him. Don't go to the sheriff yet. Yet, he confirmed. Timing matters. If we go right now, he'll walk. He's careful. What we have right now is pattern, not evidence. We need to give him the opportunity to produce evidence. She sat with that for a moment. It made a cold kind of sense, the kind of sense she didn't love, but could recognize as real. How long, she asked. Not long. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It's not. I'm sorry. She'd never heard him say that before. The apology landed differently because of it, not like a deflection, but like something he meant. Jack, she said, I need to ask you something and I need you to actually answer it. Ask. That jacket, the black one that was on the hook in your office, where is it? He looked at her steadily. In my truck, he said. Why, well, because I might need it. What is it? He held her gaze for a moment that stretched out longer than comfortable. A reminder, he said finally, of what I am when I stop being careful about what I am. She wanted to ask more. She looked at his face and understood that she'd gotten as far as she was going to get on that particular line of questions, and she filed what she had away, and she went back to work. Derek came back on a Sunday. He came alone, which was the first thing that surprised her. No men flanking him, no positioning, no architectural intimidation. Just Derek walking through the door at 11 in the morning during the small rush of the late breakfast crowd. The only real crowd, the cafe had managed to hold on to truckers heading out for Sunday runs and sliding into the same corner booth like he owned it. Emma brought him coffee without being asked. She didn't speak. She set the cup down and turned to leave. Tell Mitchell I need to talk to him, Derek said. He's off today, Emma said. This was not a lie. Jack had driven to Phoenix that morning for the remaining paperwork on Daniel Carter's hospital account, which Emma had asked him to handle because she couldn't face the billing department one more time. Another piece of timing that in retrospect felt less like coincidence and more like Derek knowing Jack's schedule in ways he shouldn't. Derek looked at her. Sit down, he said. She didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the booth with her order pad and looked at him with the full weight of the last 3 weeks behind her eyes. Sit, he said again differently. She sat. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. For a moment he looked almost human. Not a threatening human, but a human with thoughts behind his face rather than calculations. Then he leaned forward. I want you to understand something, he said. This isn't personal. This is business. You and your boss have made it harder than it needs to be, and that's cost both of us. And I'm here to tell you that cost goes in one direction if it keeps going. He paused. I know about your father's bills. I know about the revenue you've been losing. I know your name is on the loan for this building. She hadn't known that he knew the loan was in her name too. The information hit her like a cold hand. I know everything about this place, Derek said quietly. So I want you to hear me very clearly when I say this doesn't have to be destruction. I'm offering you a business arrangement. Manageable payments protection, that's real, no more pressure. You pay me, you keep your cafe, you keep your loan, you keep your life the way it is. He sat back. Mitchell doesn't have to be part of it. In fact, Mitchell might be your problem. Think about it. Emma looked at him. At the careful reasonableness of him, the way he'd shifted registers from intimidation to something that almost sounded like concern, and she understood something she'd been circling for weeks. This was a man who had learned to be frightening in multiple languages. The loud version was just the opening. This was the real version. This was the one that was supposed to make you feel like you had a choice. I'll pass along the message, she said. Good. He took a sip of coffee. He reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. My number, in case Mitchell wants to discuss terms. He looked at her. And Emma, don't wait too long. My patience is a resource. It's not unlimited. He got up and left. She sat in the booth for a full minute after he'd gone. The truckers around her ate their eggs and talked about routes and weather and didn't look at her. She looked at the piece of paper on the table. Then she picked it up, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She called Jack before his truck had even reached the Phoenix city limits. She told him everything, word for word, as close as she could get. The part about the loan, the part about the payments, the part about Mitchell might be your problem. Jack listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. He knows your loan is in your name, Jack said. Yes. He didn't know that 3 weeks ago. He's had someone looking. I figured. Another silence. She could hear road noise on his end. She heard him exhale slowly. Emma, he said, I'm going to tell you something that I need you to hear and not react to immediately. Okay? He's right that my name is a complication for you. Not in the way he means, but in the sense that if he knows I have a particular kind of past and he connects that to the cafe, it creates a different kind of risk for you. She let the words settle. What kind of past, Jack? Exactly what kind? Silence. The kind, he said finally, that wears a black vest with patches. She'd known it. On some level, the way you know things before you're ready to know them, she'd known it since the night she'd watched his shadow lift the jacket from the hook. But hearing him say it out loud in that even careful voice on a Sunday morning on a highway phone call, it rearranged something in the room of her understanding. The Hells Angels, she said, not a question. Yes, you were. Were is the word I prefer, he said. Yes. She pressed her back against the side of the booth and looked at the ceiling. One of the truckers nearby laughed at something his companion said, a sudden bark of laughter that startled her. She let the laughter settle and the silence come back. For how long, she asked. Long enough that my name still means something to people who operate in that world, Jack said. And long enough that I know exactly what Derek Vaughn is and exactly how this ends if I don't handle it correctly. What does it mean that your name still means something? It means the calls I made, the people I reached out to, they listened. And they're paying attention to what's happening here. And if Derek does something stupid, there will be consequences that have nothing to do with the law. Emma held the phone very tight. Jack, are you putting us in the middle of something bigger than Derek Vaughn? No, he said immediately and with conviction. I am not. What I'm doing is making sure that certain people understand that this cafe, this highway, stretch, these people, they're under my protection. That's a specific language, and it carries specific weight, and it will make Derek think twice before he escalates. And if he doesn't think twice, the road noise hummed on his end. Then I stop thinking about what I'm supposed to be now, Jack said, and I go back to what I was. She didn't know what to say to that. She sat in the booth in the cafe. Her name was on the loan for, and turned her phone in her hands after he'd hung up and thought about a man spending years building himself into something quieter and kinder than what he'd been, and whether the quieter, kinder thing could hold its ground against something like Derek Vaughn. She didn't reach a conclusion. She went back behind the counter and started the lunch prep. What happened next did not come in one dramatic moment. It came in small, accumulated steps over the following 11 days. Each one, another notch of pressure applied with that same deliberate, patient precision Jack had identified and Emma had come to dread. First, the supply delivery didn't come. She called the distributor, a company out of Tucson she'd been working with for 3 years, and was told with an awkwardness that telegraphed everything that her account had been flagged for routing review and deliveries were paused pending resolution. She pushed. She asked for a supervisor. The supervisor was apologetic and careful and said nothing useful, and the delivery stayed paused. She called Jack. He said he'd look into it. 3 days later, a health inspector showed up. Not their regular inspector, a man she'd never seen presenting credentials. She had no reason to doubt who went through the kitchen with a specificity that had nothing casual about it. He cited 2 violations, one related to a door seal on the walk-in cooler, one related to a temperature log that was technically current but hadn't been signed in the correct column. Both were minor. Both required correction within 10 days. Both were the kind of thing that could be fixed easily, reported accurately, and resolved without consequence. And both Emma understood with a cold clarity were the kind of thing that could be found only by someone who was looking specifically and hard. She fixed both violations the same day. When she told Jack, he nodded slowly. He has a city contact, he said, someone in the licensing office or health department. He's done this before, uses regulatory pressure as a softening mechanism before the final ask. The final ask, Emma repeated. What does that look like? It looks like a number that's supposed to feel like a relief after everything else, Jack said. He makes the environment unlivable, and then he offers to make it livable again. The offer feels generous by that point. And people take it. Most people take it, Jack said, because by that point, they've lost the ability to imagine getting through it another way. Emma looked at him. I haven't lost that ability. He looked back at her, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something in his face that wasn't careful or controlled or held back. Something that looked briefly like pride. I know, he said. That's why this works. What works? But he'd already turned back to his coffee. She didn't find out what he meant until the following Wednesday. She was alone in the cafe in the mid-afternoon, same dead zone between lunch and dinner, same quiet that had gotten quieter over the weeks until it felt less like peace and more like abandonment. She was restocking the napkin holders and running numbers in her head again, always when the door opened. She expected a trucker. Instead, she got 2 women. They were both somewhere in their 50s. One was tall, with short silver hair and a road-worn denim jacket. The other was compact dark and had the kind of stillness about her that reminded Emma of Jack. The quality of someone who didn't move unnecessarily, who had learned that stillness was its own kind of information. They sat at the counter. Emma brought them water. "Coffee," the taller one said, "and you can tell Jack we're here." Emma froze. "You know Jack?" The woman looked at her. Her eyes were patient and very direct. "He called us 12 days ago. We've been watching this situation, and we'd like to talk to him now." Emma went to Jack's office. She knocked. "There are two women at the counter," she said when he opened the door. "They say you called them 12 days ago." Jack's expression, for just a second, showed something she'd never seen on it before. Not surprise, closer to relief. Like a man who'd been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been offered a place to set it down. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I was wondering when they'd show." He came out of the office and walked to the counter. When the taller woman saw him, she tilted her head slightly. "You look old," she said. "You look exactly the same," Jack said. "Don't flatter me." But something softened slightly at the corners of her eyes. "Sit down, we need to talk." Emma went to the far end of the counter and tried very hard not to listen, which meant she heard fragments. The name Derek Vaughn, a street in Tucson, a number that might have been a date or a case number. And one sentence from the taller woman spoken quietly but clearly. "The Brotherhood has a position on this, Jack. You reach out after 5 years, this is the position. We protect what you protect. You know the price of that." And Jack's voice, equally quiet, "I know the price. I've known it since I made the call." Emma polished a counter that was already clean and thought about what it meant to know the price of something and pay it anyway. The women stayed for 40 minutes. They drank their coffee. The taller one left a 20 on the counter for an $8 tab. They walked out to a truck parked at the far edge of the lot and drove away without looking back. Jack stood at the counter for a moment after they'd gone. "Jack," Emma said. What did you agree to?" He looked at the door where they'd exited. "To let people who know what they're doing be involved," he said. "On my terms, not theirs, but involved." "Hell's Angels," she said, not cautiously, just flatly, getting it on the table. "Former," he said, "mostly. These things are complicated." He looked at her. "Are you scared of that?" She thought about it genuinely. She thought about Harriet's shaking hands. She thought about the inspectors. She thought about her father's photograph dropped on concrete. "I'm less scared of that," she said, "than I am of Derek." Jack nodded. "Okay then." He went back to his office. Emma stood at the counter alone and she thought something is coming. She didn't know the shape of it yet. She didn't know the timing, but in the specific way that you can feel weather changing before the air, she felt it. A shift, a gathering. The highway outside was quiet, but something was listening to it, and Derek Vaughn had no idea. I was about to find out what it meant to apply pressure to the wrong man's life, to the wrong woman's home, to the wrong place on this long, forgettable stretch of Arizona asphalt. He had decided that Jack Mitchell was a tired old man with nothing left behind him. What Derek couldn't know, what no one who looked at Jack from the outside could know, was that the thing behind Jack Mitchell wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for a good enough reason to come back. And Emma Carter, standing in that quiet cafe with her father's cracked photograph in her jacket pocket and her name on the loan and her last $200 gone, was a good enough reason. She was the best reason Jack had found in years. The night before everything changed, Emma couldn't eat. She stood behind the counter at closing time with a bowl of soup she'd made herself going cold in front of her, and she couldn't bring herself to pick up the spoon. Her body was present. The rest of her was somewhere else running calculations. She couldn't finish turning over conversations. She couldn't resolve listening for sounds on the highway that weren't there yet, but felt like they should be. Jack had been quiet all day. Not his usual quiet, which had a particular texture to it, attentive, watchful, the quiet of a man who was paying close attention to everything around him. This was different. This was the quiet of someone who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the moment to execute it. She'd watched him behind the counter all through the lunch shift, in the dead afternoon, and the thin dinner crowd, and she'd seen him check his phone twice, both times reading a message and putting the phone away without expression, without comment. She'd asked once, "Anything I should know?" He'd looked at her. "Not yet." That was 11 in the morning. By closing 9 hours later, he still hadn't added anything to it. She poured the soup down the drain, washed the bowl, dried her hands on a dish towel, and walked to the office doorway. Jack. He was at his desk, not doing paperwork. Just sitting, his hands were flat on the desk and he was looking at the wall opposite with the expression of a man reviewing something internal, something long and complicated, that had no document and no conclusion. "I'm going home," she said. "Unless you think I shouldn't." He looked at her. "Take the long way. Park on the street, not the lot behind your building." Her stomach tightened. That's specific, he said, "and text me when you're inside." "Jack, what's happening tomorrow?" He held her gaze. "Derek's going to make a move," he said. "He's been building to it for 3 weeks. The supply cut off the inspection. Those were softeners. He's out of patience now." "How do you know?" "Because I know his pattern, and because someone told me." "Who told you?" He glanced at the desk. She followed his eyes to his phone lying face down on the surface. "One of the people who's been watching him," Jack said. "He's planning something for tomorrow morning, something that's meant to be final." Emma felt cold travel down her spine. Not the quick cold of shock, but the slow cold of something you've been dreading long enough, that when it arrives, it almost feels like relief, the confirmation that you weren't being paranoid, that what you feared was real. "What kind of something?" she asked. "I don't know the specifics," Jack said. "I know the intent. He wants to close this. He's going to make an example." She stood in the doorway and thought about what an example looked like in Derek Vaughn's vocabulary. She thought about the tires and the photograph and the inspector and Harriet Cole's shaking hands. "Of you," she asked. "Or of me?" Jack looked at her steadily. "Of the cafe." She understood what that meant. "Go home," Jack said. "Seriously, long way, text me when you're inside, lock the door." She went home. She took the long way. She texted him. She lay on her bed in her clothes and stared at the dark for most of the night, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, she heard motorcycles on a road nearby, not close enough to identify direction. Just the low rolling sound of engines in the dark. And she wasn't sure if she'd actually heard them or dreamed them. She was at the cafe at 5:15, 45 minutes before her usual opening time. Jack's truck was already there. He was in his office with the door open. The leather jacket was on the desk in front of him. Not on the hook, not in the truck, on the desk, laid flat, the way you'd lay out something you were preparing to put on. He was looking at it the way you look at something you have a complicated history with. Not tenderness, exactly. Recognition. Emma came to the doorway and looked at the jacket and then at him. "Today," she said. "Today," he confirmed. She looked at the jacket more carefully in the morning light. She'd glimpsed it before, but never studied it. It was old, genuinely old, not vintage store, old, worn in life old. The leather had creased and softened in the specific patterns of long use. There were patches on the back that she could see, even with it laid flat, colors faded but legible. The main patch at the top she could read clearly now for the first time, Hell's Angels in an arc. Below it, a death's head, below that Arizona. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Does it still fit?" she asked finally. He almost smiled. "Yes. You kept it all this time. You keep the things that tell you the truth about yourself," he said, "even when you don't want to." She sat in the chair against the wall, the same chair she'd sat in 100 times to go over invoices with him, and she looked at the jacket and thought about everything the last 3 weeks had built toward. "Jack," she said, "tell me something real, not protected, not managed. Something real." He looked at her. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He thought about that for a long moment. Actually thought about it, which she appreciated, because he could have just said no and she'd have known it was performance. "Not of Derek," he said. "Not of what's going to happen today." He paused. "I'm afraid of what it means. Going back to this." He glanced at the jacket. "I built something different here. This cafe. You. The people on this highway. I built it out of a decision to be different than I was. And today I have to reach back into what I was and use it. And I don't know if I can do that without it costing me something on the other side." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She felt it land with the specific weight of real things that don't have tidy edges. "You're not reaching back to be what you were," she said. "You're reaching back to protect something you built. That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Maybe." He stood up. He picked up the jacket. He put it on in the office, not making a show of it, just a man getting dressed. But Emma watched and felt the atmosphere of the room shift in a way she couldn't have quantified. It was the same Jack, same face, same posture, same quiet. But the jacket changed the information the room was receiving about him. It was like watching a word change meaning in a new context. Same letters, different weight. He walked out to the main floor. She followed. He unlocked the front door, flipped the sign to open, and then stood behind the counter with his hands on the surface and looked out through the front windows at the highway. Morning light was coming up strong now, the good October kind that didn't have the brutality of summer behind it. A couple of early trucks had already passed. The day looked ordinary from the outside. "What do we do?" Emma asked. "We open," Jack said. "Same as every morning. Coffee on breakfast menu, ready doors open. And when Derek comes, we serve him coffee," Jack feed. Bah. "Same as always." She looked at him. "That's it. That's our part," Jack said. "The rest is already in motion." She wanted to ask what that meant. She was getting better at reading when questions would be answered and when they'd hit a wall, and this one had the texture of a wall. She turned and started the coffee and pulled the breakfast menu out and put it in the window. At 6:43, the first customer of the day came in. Kenny Roach, a regular trucker who'd kept coming despite everything stubborn as a fence post. He sat at the counter and ordered his usual without looking at the menu because he'd never needed the menu in 4 years. And Emma brought him his coffee and his eggs and was grateful for the normalcy of it in a way she'd never have thought to be 3 months ago. Kenny ate. Emma worked. Jack stood. At 7:15, a truck she didn't recognize pulled into the lot. Then another. Then another. Not Derek's vehicles. These were older personal trucks and SUVs scattered in without pattern, each pulling in separately and parking with a deliberateness that was coordinated without looking coordinated. By 7:30, there were 9 vehicles in the lot, more than the cafe had seen in a month. People got out and came in. Emma watched them arrive. Men, mostly some women, ranging from their late 30s to their mid-60s. They were dressed ordinarily: jeans, work boots, flannels. Some wore jackets, some didn't. They came in small groups of 2 or 3, found seats, ordered coffee. They talked quietly among themselves. They were polite to Emma in the direct, non-effusive way of people who were focused on something else. She brought coffee to a table of 3 near the window. One of them, a man with a gray beard and hands like a pipe wrench, looked up at her. "Thank you, darling." "You're welcome." She looked at him and then at the others. Do you know Jack?" The man with the gray beard looked at her with a kind of steady warmth. "We know Jack," he said, "known him a long time." By 8 o'clock, the cafe was the fullest it had been in 3 weeks. Emma moved between tables, pouring coffee and taking orders, and felt something strange happening in her chest. Something between anxiety and something that rhymed with hope. She didn't know what all these people represented exactly, but she knew what their presence felt like. It felt like a counterweight, like someone had put their hand on a scale. Jack stood behind the counter through all of it. He didn't mingle, didn't circulate. He stood where he was and drank his coffee and watched the room with those deep-set eyes that were reading everything and reporting nothing. At 8:22, Kenny Roach put his fork down and looked out the window and said to nobody in particular, "Huh." Emma followed his gaze. Derek's SUV was pulling into the lot. He came with 6 men this time. She counted them through the window as they got out: Derek and 6 others, more than he'd ever brought before. The final ask, Jack had said, something that's meant to be final. She understood now what final looked like on Derek's scale. It looked like enough men to handle any resistance with certainty, enough bodies to make the arithmetic unambiguous before anyone even spoke. What Derek apparently had not done or had done and miscalculated was count the vehicles already in the lot. She watched his face as he got out of his SUV and surveyed the parking area. Something crossed it, not alarm yet, but something adjacent to recalibration. He said something to the man beside him. The man said something back. Derek's jaw tightened slightly. He came in anyway. The bell above the door chimed. The entire cafe heard it, and every person in the room who had come in before 8 o'clock did something subtle. They didn't look up, didn't turn, didn't make any visible movement. They just became slightly more still. It was so coordinated, it was almost choreographed, and yet it looked to anyone watching casually like nothing more than a quiet breakfast crowd ignoring the door. Derek stopped just inside the entrance. He took in the room. His eyes moved methodically table to table, face to face, not reading customers' cataloging. Emma watched him do it and watched the precise moment when the math finished in his head, when the number of unfamiliar faces in a cafe he'd thought he'd successfully hollowed out stopped adding up to coincidence. He looked at Jack behind the counter. Jack looked back at him, waited. Derek crossed the room. His men filtered in behind him, and Emma felt the room absorb them, not tensing, not reacting, simply incorporating their presence the way a river incorporates a stone, flowing around it. Derek stopped at the counter. "Mitchell," he said. "Derek," Jack said. "Coffee." Derek looked at him, at the jacket, the patches. Emma watched Derek's eyes stop on the main patch, linger there for just under 2 seconds, then move back to Jack's face. In that 2 seconds, she saw him do the same thing she'd seen him do the moment he'd walked through the door: assess, recalibrate, adjust. He was good at it. She'd give him that. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," Derek said. His voice was controlled, even the boardroom voice he'd deployed in the booth 2 Sundays ago, still operating as if complexity could be managed through register. "I don't think so," Jack said. "I think you made it complicated when you grabbed her arm." Derek's eyes moved to Emma for just a moment, then back. "Business disagreements get heated. That's unfortunate. I'm here to resolve the disagreement." "I know why you're here," Jack said. "So let's skip the frame." Derek set his hands on the counter the same way he had the first time he'd ever come behind it, pressing his palms flat, leaning forward. But something was different now. The geometry was different. Before, that lean had been territorial. "I'm taking up space in your environment." Now it looked like something else, like a man finding something to hold on to. "You know what I can do to this place," Derek said quietly so only Jack and Emma could hear. "I don't want to do that, but I will." Jack looked at him. His voice was equally quiet, conversational. "I know what you can do," Jack said, "and I know what's been done to her in the last 3 weeks. The tires, the distributor, the inspector. The money you took. The photograph." He paused. "Her father's photograph." Derek's expression didn't change. "I need you to understand something," Jack said. "I didn't call these people in here because I wanted an audience. I called them because they needed to see this with their own eyes. Because what comes next is their decision too, not just mine." Derek looked at the room. He looked at his 6 men spread around the space. He looked at the 12 people sitting quietly at tables and the 2 at the counter. He did the arithmetic again, and this time something behind his eyes shifted from recalibration into something raw. "You don't want this kind of war," Derek said. "No," Jack agreed. "I really don't. That's why I made a different call." Derek stared at him. "What call?" Jack picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He set it down. "About 2 hours ago," Jack said, "a man named Sheriff Dale Whitmore received a package. Not a phone call, a package. Documented. 3 weeks of Derek Vaughn's operation along this highway strip. 16 businesses, 43 specific incidents, dates, amounts, statements from 7 business owners who agreed to go on record." He held Derek's gaze, "including the health inspector who ran your errand last week. He decided that being on the right side of this was worth more than your arrangement." The room had gone very quiet, not tense quiet, listening quiet. Derek had stopped breathing in any visible way. His hands were still on the counter. His face had gone through several iterations in the last 5 seconds, the kind of rapid internal recalculation that only shows on the surface when someone is genuinely, unexpectedly cornered. "You're bluffing," Derek said. "I'm not. You don't have 7 statements." "I have 9, Jack said. 7 was the minimum I wanted. 9 was what showed up." Emma gripped the edge of the counter behind her without realizing she was doing it. She looked at Derek's face and saw something she'd never expected to see there, the specific look of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he'd already decided was not capable of outmaneuvering him. It was a particular kind of shock, almost personal. "This is a mistake," Derek said. The boardroom voice was fraying at the edges, now threads coming loose. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Derek," Jack's voice was very calm. "Sit down." Derek looked at him. "Sit down," Jack said again, "because you're about to make this worse, and there are 9 people in this room right now watching you decide whether to do that. And what they decide to do next depends entirely on what you do in the next 30 seconds. For the first time since Derek had walked through the door at the Desert Rose 3 weeks ago, He looked at Jack Mitchell and did not see an old man in an apron. He sat down. Jack came around from behind the counter and sat across from Derek in the corner booth. He looked Emma at the counter with a single look that communicated everything he needed it to stay there. "You're fine, let me work." She stayed. She watched. She couldn't hear the conversation from where she was standing. Jack had lowered his voice to something that didn't carry across the room, and Derek, for the first time in Emma's experience of him, was not projecting. She watched Derek's posture change across the duration of whatever Jack was saying, watched the aggressive forward lean become something more vertical, watched his hands move from the table to his lap, watched his jaw work and stop and work again. The man with the gray beard at the window table caught Emma's eye. He gave a single slow nod, the kind that means this is going the way it's supposed to go. She made another pot of coffee. She was pouring it when she heard Derek say loudly enough for the room to catch, "You can't do this," and heard Jack say in that same conversational even tone, "It's already done." "Then you think the law is—" "The law," Jack said, "already has the package. What the law does with it isn't in your control or mine for us. What is in your control is what you do in the next 10 minutes. Then a long silence. Then Derek said something she couldn't catch, low and rough, the sound of a man who was reconfiguring his understanding of a situation he thought he owned. Then Jack said, "No, not a negotiation. This is an accounting." Another silence. Then Jack said something that made Derek look up at him with an expression Emma had never expected to see on that face. She was too far away to be certain, but it looked almost just around the edges, like something close to shame. She kept pouring coffee. She kept moving. At Nini 17, Jack stood up from the booth. Derek remained seated. His 6 men were still in the room, scattered, but they'd lost the quality of threat they'd carried in with them. They were just men standing in a crowded cafe now, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Jack walked back behind the counter. He stood next to Emma. "Okay," she asked quietly. "Getting there," he said. Then the door opened. Not the chime of one person. The chime and a rush of air and the particular sound of a door pushed open wider than usual and held. 2 men walked in wearing Arizona State Patrol uniforms. Behind them, in civilian clothes with a badge on his belt, a man Emma had never seen. Mid-50s, deliberate of face, like he'd spent a long career being the least surprised person in the room. The man with the badge looked at Jack. Jack looked at him. "Dale," Jack said. Jack, the sheriff, looked around the room, at Derek in the booth, at Derek's 6 men, at the 12 people who were still quietly sitting at their tables with their coffee. He took it all in the way a man takes in a room he's been given a detailed briefing about and is confirming matches expectations. "Package arrived at 7:40, Sheriff Whitmore said. "I know," Jack said. The sheriff looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. "Derek Valrain," the sheriff said, "I'm going to need you to come with me." Derek stood slowly. He was not handcuffed immediately. Sheriff Whitmore was doing this cleanly, professionally, the kind of arrest that is made by someone who already has everything they need and therefore has nothing to prove in the moment of execution. Derek looked at his men once. The look communicated nothing operable. There was no plan to execute, no instruction to carry out, no escape that this moment offered. The men understood. They began filtering toward the door on their own. One by one, the specific, orderly dispersal of people who know when a situation has concluded. Derek walked past the counter. He stopped. He looked at Emma. She looked back at him. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of resolution. What she felt was closer to exhaustion. The specific emptiness that comes when you've been holding yourself against a force for so long that when the force disappears, you don't immediately feel free. You just feel the absence of the weight, and the absence is its own strange kind of disorienting. "You got lucky," Derek said. Emma held his gaze. "No," she said. "I got a boss who gives a damn." Derek held her gaze for just a moment. Then he looked at Jack, and something passed across his face that Emma would think about for a long time afterward. Not respect, not exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood that he completely misread the thing he was dealing with, and that the misreading was on him, and that there's nothing left to say about it. He walked out. Sheriff Whitmore followed. The 2 State Patrol officers followed. The bell above the door chimed. The room held its breath for a full 3 seconds. Then Kenny Roach picked up his fork and took a bite of his eggs, and the room exhaled, and somebody at a table near the window said quietly, Well then, and somebody else said, anybody want more coffee? And the cafe became in the space of about 8 seconds a room full of people eating breakfast again. Emma turned to the coffee pot. Her hands were shaking. Not badly small, controlled tremors, the aftershock of adrenaline working out of a system that had been living on it for weeks. She poured coffee into a mug, misjudged the angle slightly, put the pot down, and gripped the edge of the counter and breathed. Jack's hand came down on the counter beside hers. Not touching, just present. You're okay, he said. I know, she said. Give me a second. She took the second. She breathed through it. She picked up the coffee pot again, and her hands were steady. She started making rounds. The people who'd come in before 8 o'clock stayed for another hour. They ate paid, tipped well. They said goodbye to Jack individually, not with big emotional scenes, not with lengthy exchanges. Most of them just caught his eye when they were leaving, held it for a second, gave a nod of the particular variety that carries full sentences without needing any of them spoken. Some of them shook his hand. The man with the gray beard and hands like a pipe wrench stopped at the counter last. You squared it right, he said to Jack. Tried to, Jack said. No, I mean right. The man glanced at Emma. You handled it the way you used to handle the things that actually mattered. Not the other stuff. The things that mattered. Jack looked at him for a moment. Thank you for coming. Didn't have to think about it, the man said. None of us did. He left. Jack stood at the counter and watched the last of them go, and Emma watched Jack. She'd seen him in 5 years of morning shifts, in invoice arguments, in equipment breakdowns, in bad weather, in the slow, painful months of her father's illness, in the worst months after. She knew his silences the way you know the silences of someone who has been your constant. And this silence was different from any of them, not closed, not contained, not the protective silence of a man managing distance from his own interior. This was an open silence, a tired one. The silence of someone who has just put down something heavy and is sitting with the fact of its absence. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. He looked at it. He didn't pick it up. Jack, she said, what did you say to him in the booth? What made him just sit there? I was quiet for a moment. Then, I told him I knew everything about his operation from the last 4 years. Every business, every arrangement, every person he'd pressured or paid off. The inspector, the distributor, contact the county licensing clerk. He paused. And I told him that every piece of that information was now in more hands than he could ever identify or reach. That it didn't matter what he did to me or to this cafe or to anyone along this highway. That information was already out and it would keep moving, and the only question was whether he wanted to be in front of it or behind it. Emma thought about that, and that was enough to make him sit down. That and the fact that he looked around the room and counted the people in it, Jack said, and understood that every single one of them had seen his face, and that he didn't know who any of them were. He picked up the coffee now. That's the thing about operating in the dark for a long time. You stop being able to see in the light. She leaned on the counter. And the sheriff's package, was that real? Jack looked at her with a mild expression. Emma. What? Of course it was real. He took a sip. What do you think I was doing in my office for 11 nights? She stared at him. You were building the case this whole time. Somebody had to, he said. And I had resources Derek didn't know about. The women who came in, the man with the gray beard, all of them. People who've been watching Derek's operation for a while, Jack said. For their own reasons. When I reached out, they shared what they had. And 7 of the business owners along the strip, people who've been suffering under Derek longer than we have, when they understood there was a real option, a real structure, real legal protection behind it, they agreed to go on record. Emma sat with that, the full scope of it, the weeks of silent construction happening in that office while she'd been running the floor and counting her tips and lying awake at night running math. He'd been building while she'd been holding on, and she realized that was the division of labor he'd understood from the beginning. She held the cafe open, kept it breathing, refused to give an inch, and that refusal was not just stubbornness. It was strategy. It was evidence. Every day the cafe stayed open and defiant was another day in the pattern Jack was documenting. I was part of it, she said slowly. My being here every day, not giving in, that was part of what you needed. He looked at her. You were the whole thing, and he said, I supplied the structure. You supplied the reason the structure was worth building. She looked at the counter for a moment. She looked at the cracked photograph she'd propped up behind the register 2 days ago, her father's laughing, squinting face in the old Arizona sun. Dad would have loved this, she said. Jack followed her gaze to the photograph. Something moved briefly across his face. Yeah, he said, he would have. She looked at him. You knew my dad. It was not a question. She'd arrived at it the way you arrive at certain things, not through deduction, but through accumulation, detail by detail. And then suddenly you're there and it's obvious. Jack looked at the photograph. A long time ago, he said, before the cafe, before a lot of things. He set down his coffee cup. He never wanted you to know. Why cup? Because he was ashamed of some of the years he knew me in, Jack said, and he didn't want any of that near you. He paused. He reached out when he got sick, said he had a daughter working the highway, and he needed someone he trusted to watch out for her. He didn't ask me to tell you. He just asked me to be here. Emma stood very still. The cafe hummed around her, the coffee machine, cycling a truck passing on the highway, Kenny Roach's fork against his plate. She looked at this old man with his gray hair and his denim eyes and his black leather jacket, and she understood that her father, who had fixed things until he had nothing left to pour, had done one final thing. He had found the strongest, most reliable person he still trusted in the world and positioned him to be there when she needed him. He sent you to me, she said. He sent himself to you, Jack said. I was just the delivery mechanism. She put her hand on the counter between them. He looked at it. He put his hand over it briefly, carefully, the way you touch something that matters. Then he picked up the coffee pot. Breakfast crowd's thinning, he said. You should get the lunch menu in the window. She almost laughed. She stood up straight. She got the lunch menu. But as she walked to the window to put it in place, she felt the weight of the last 3 weeks differently, not lighter exactly, because things that have happened don't unhappen, but placed, contextualized, put into the frame where they made sense. Her father had been gone 6 months. He'd left her the necklace, and the cafe loan, and the mountain of unpaid bills, and the long quiet proof that love sometimes operates through proxies, through arrangements made before the end, through old friendships that run deeper than either person in them could fully explain. She put the lunch menu in the window. She looked out at the highway. Derek Vaughn's SUV was gone from the lot. The ordinary trucks and cars of the ordinary world had taken its space. The highway was moving the way highways move, indifferent, continuous, carrying its people from one place toward the next. She turned back to the cafe. Jack was behind the counter. He'd taken off the leather jacket. He had his apron on. He was wiping down the surface with the dish towel, the same motion she'd watched him make 10,000 times, steady and unremarkable, and entirely, completely, perfectly ordinary. And she thought some people protect you loudly. They stand in front of you and announce themselves. They make sure you see it. And some people sit in a locked office for 11 nights, building the architecture of your safety piece by piece, saying nothing, letting you think you're holding on alone because they know that the holding on is yours to do. And when the moment comes, they put on the jacket and the room changes and you understand that you were never alone at all. The afternoon after Derek's arrest was the strangest quiet Emma had ever felt inside the Desert Rose. Not empty quiet, not the hollowed-out silence of the last 3 weeks, the silence of a place being slowly starved. This was different, fuller somehow, the way a room feels after a long argument has finally ended and all the charged air has settled back down and you're just standing in the ordinary space again, tired and relieved and not quite sure what to do with your hands. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She reorganized the condiment shelf twice. She wiped down the counter with the same cloth in the same direction 6 times and only realized she'd done it when Kenny Roach, who had stayed well past his usual hour and was on his 4th cup of coffee, pointed at the cloth and said, "Emma, the counter is clean." She stopped. She looked at the cloth. "Right. You okay?" "Getting there." "That's fair," Kenny said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "That was something this morning." "Yeah. I'm glad I stayed. I almost didn't come back. I want you to know that. After what happened, what those guys said at the way station, I almost just found a different route." He looked at his mug. "But I kept thinking about how you never said a word about it. Never asked me to stay, never made me feel guilty. Just brought me my coffee and let me go." Emma looked at him. "You came back." I did, Kenny said. Sometimes you have to decide what kind of person you are and just be that. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Jack stayed in his office with the door open. She could see him through the gap on the phone for long stretches, writing things down and occasionally looking up at nothing in particular, the way people do when they're processing more information than can fit comfortably in the front of their mind. He came out twice, once for coffee, once to help her when the lunch crowd, a real lunch crowd, 5 tables occupied, more than they'd had in a month, hit simultaneously, and she needed hands on the floor. He worked the tables without making it a thing. No commentary, no acknowledgement that this was unusual. He just picked up a pot and a notepad and moved through the room and did the job, and Emma watched him do it and thought about what he'd told her that morning and felt the landscape of her understanding of him rearrange itself quietly and permanently. At 2 in the afternoon, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. Arizona area code Phoenix prefix. She almost let it go to voicemail, and then something made her answer. Is this Emma Carter? A woman's voice. Professional. Measured. Yes. My name is Andrea Reyes. I'm an attorney with the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office. We've been working with Sheriff Whitmore's department on the Derek Vaughn case. I was hoping to speak with you sometime in the next day or two. Emma's hand tightened on the phone. Is he out? Did he? No, the woman said quickly. No, Mr. Vaughn is in custody. He'll remain there. I'm calling because we want to add your specific incident to the formal charges. The theft, the physical contact, the threats. Your account is important to the case. A pause. I understand this has been difficult. I want you to know that the evidence package we received this morning is exceptional. Whoever put it together has significant experience with how this kind of prosecution works. Emma looked at Jack's office door. Yeah, she said, he does. Would you be willing to come in? Give a statement. Yes, Emma said, absolutely yes. She hung up and went to Jack's doorway. He looked up. DA's office, she said. He nodded slowly. Andrea Reyes, she stared at him. You knew she'd call. I included your incident specifically in the package, he said. Your name, dates, the money, the photograph. I wanted her to have it. He paused. Is that all right? I should have told you. It's all right, Emma said. It's more than all right. She leaned against the door frame. Jack, how much of this did you actually plan? He tilted his head slightly. Most of it. The 11 nights in the office. The evidence structure, yes. The sheriff's contact, I'd met Dale Whitmore 3 years ago, did him a favor with information on a different situation. I knew he was clean. I knew he'd move on good evidence. He tapped his pen on the notepad. The business owners along the strip that took longer. People who've been under Derek's thumb for 2 years don't trust quickly. It took about a week of conversations before the first one agreed to go on record. After that, it moved faster. And the people who came in this morning. Insurance, he said simply. In case Derek came in a different spirit than he did. In case the conversation didn't go the way it went. He paused. I didn't want to need them. But I needed to be ready to need them. Emma looked at him steadily. Were you ever actually going to fight him physically? Jack was quiet for a moment. If he'd touched you again, he said yes. The honesty of it sat in the room between them. But you were hoping not to, she said. I've been hoping not to do a lot of things for a lot of years, Jack said. Mostly I've succeeded. He looked at his notepad. The jacket was a message, not a weapon. I wanted him to see it and understand that what was standing across from him was not what he'd been dealing with. It worked. It worked because the rest of the structure was already in place, he said. The jacket alone is just an old man in leather. The jacket plus 9 documented statements, plus a sheriff who already has the package, plus a room full of people who know things Derek doesn't know. They know that's a different conversation. Emma sat down in the chair against the wall. She looked at the jacket folded now on top of the filing cabinet, at the vest underneath it with the patches. Can I ask you something about my dad? She said. Jack set down his pen. Yes. Did he know when you opened this cafe, did he know it was you? Like that it was specifically you here? Jack's expression shifted slightly. I reached out to him when I decided to settle here. This was 11 years ago. I told him I was done with the life I was buying this place. I was going straight, whatever that means for a man like me. He said that was the best news he'd heard in a long time. He paused, and then he said, if you ever need a reason to stay straight, I've got one. He told me he had a daughter who was working the highway and who was going to need a job soon and who was, in his words, too stubborn to ask for help and too good to go without it. Emma felt her throat tighten. So he sent me to you, she said. Not later when he got sick. From the beginning. From the beginning, Jack confirmed. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment, not to stop tears. She'd made her peace with those long ago, but to hold the shape of the feeling while it was this precise before it spread into something harder to hold. He never told me any of that, she said. No, Jack said. He was protecting you from his past by not explaining the present. He looked at her. You can decide whether you think that was right or wrong. I spent a lot of years doing the same thing to people I cared about, and I'm still not sure what I think about it. Emma looked at the desk, at her father's careful and visible logic, the man who fixed things, who had in his last years arranged one final repair, a human one, a bridge between his daughter and the most reliable person he'd ever known. Setting it up so quietly that it looked like coincidence. So quietly that even Emma, who'd spent 5 years working beside Jack Mitchell every morning, had never seen the seam. How was a good man, Jack said quietly. Complicated in his earlier years like most of us. But the man he became, the best version of him, that man was your father. She looked up. Were you like that? Did you have a best version that came later? He met her eyes. I'm working on it, he said. This is what working on it looks like. Harriet Cole came back the next morning. Emma saw her through the window pulling into the lot at 7:42, 5 minutes later, than her usual 7:37. She parked and sat in her car for a moment. Emma could see her through the windshield, hands in her lap, collecting herself, and then she got out and came through the door. She stopped just inside the entrance. The cafe was half full already, the morning beginning to find its old rhythm. She looked around at the tables, at the counter, at Emma behind it. Her eyes were red at the rims in the way that suggested recent crying or very bad sleep or both. I heard what happened, Harriet said. Someone at my book club called. She drives this highway and she knew a man who was here. Word travels, Emma said. I'm ashamed of myself, Harriet said directly without softening it. I left. I told myself I had a bad heart and I couldn't afford the stress, but the truth is I was scared and I let that override everything else. Emma looked at her. Harriet, you're here now. That's not enough. It's a start. Emma came around the counter. Do you want your usual table? Harriet's mouth worked for a moment. Then she nodded and let Emma lead her to the table she'd sat at every weekday morning for 4 years, and she sat down and put her purse in its usual place beside her on the bench and looked at the menu she'd memorized years ago and said, The usual, please. Coming right up. Emma brought her the eggs and the toast and the coffee and the $2 over a $7 tab tip that was already folded on the edge of the table when she came back. She looked at Harriet eating and felt something she'd been carrying for weeks release, not dramatically, not in a flood, but quietly in the specific way that pieces of the world returning to where they belong feels better than almost anything. By the end of the week, 4 more regulars had come back. By the end of the second week, the lunch revenue had climbed back to within 15% of where it had been before Derek. The morning numbers had not just recovered, they'd exceeded. Word had moved along the highway in the way that important information moves in close communities, selectively, reliably, and with the specific weight of something witnessed rather than reported. People knew that the Desert Rose had been threatened and had not given an inch. People knew that what had happened there had resulted in Derek Vaughn's arrest in the disruption of an operation that had been bleeding businesses along this strip for 2.5 years. People wanted to eat at a place like that. Emma managed the recovery with the same daily attention. She'd managed the crisis number by number, day by day, without getting ahead of herself. She paid the first installment of the recovered medical bill on a Tuesday using money she'd set aside, plus what Kenny Roach had pressed into her hand on his way out one Thursday morning, $200 in an envelope with nothing written on it, because Kenny Roach was exactly the kind of man who didn't want credit. She paid the distributor account back to current standing. She called the county about the health inspection corrections and scheduled the recheck and passed it clean. She fixed the walk-in cooler seal properly this time using a guy Jack knew who did refrigeration work and charged a fair price. One piece at a time, the way her father would have done it. She was in the middle of the dinner prep on a Thursday when a truck she didn't recognize pulled into the lot. Not a commercial truck, a personal pickup, older model clean. 2 men got out. They weren't bikers, or they weren't dressed like bikers, jeans and work shirts unremarkable. But they had the quality of the people who'd come through on the morning Derek was arrested, that particular stillness. They came in and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and food and were polite and unremarkable in every way. And when she brought their check, the taller one said, "You're Emma." "I am." "We heard what you did, holding it open all those weeks, not giving an inch." He looked at her directly. "That took something." "I had help," she said. "You did," the man said, "but the help wouldn't have mattered if you'd folded. The help works because you didn't fold. Jack knows how to build a structure. You were the load-bearing wall." She stared at him. "Who are you?" she asked. He put 2 20s on the counter for a $12 tab. "People who appreciate the right things happening," he said. He stood up. "Tell Jack that Reno says the old way still works." They left. She went to Jack's office. "Someone named Reno says the old way still works," she said. "Who is Reno?" Jack looked up from his paperwork. Something moved across his face, recognition, and underneath it, something that might have been gratitude. "Someone I did a significant favor for a long time ago," he said. "Someone who remembers." "They said you know how to build a structure," Emma said, "and that I was the load-bearing wall." Jack looked at her. "Reno's not wrong." "Is this going to keep happening? People coming through?" "For a while," Jack said. "Word moves. People want to see it with their own eyes. Then it'll settle." He paused. "Most of them just want coffee." She almost laughed. "Most of them leave $40 tips on $12 tabs." "Well," Jack said, "nobody said they weren't generous." Oh. The call from Andrea Reyes came again on a Friday afternoon, 10 days after the arrest. Emma had gone to the DA's office in Phoenix 3 days prior, given her statement, sat across from the attorney in a clean conference room, and told the story of the wrist in the parking lot, in the photograph, in the money, factually and completely, without embellishment, because the facts were already sufficient. Andrea Reyes was good at her job. She asked precise questions. She didn't editorialize. And at the end she'd said, "The package your employer put together is going to make this significantly easier. In my 10 years in this office, I've received maybe 3 pre-arrest evidence packages that were this organized." She'd paused. "Jack Mitchell has interesting skills for a cafe owner." Emma had said, "He's had an interesting life." Now Andrea Reyes was on the phone telling her that Derek Vaughn had entered a plea. Not innocent, he'd looked at the evidence structure in the 9 statements in the documented pattern across 16 businesses and made the calculation that his attorney also made, which was that trial would be catastrophic. "He'll face charges on 7 counts, Andrea said. "Racketeering, extortion, theft, and assault, the last one specifically for the physical contact with you. His arrangement along the highway strip is finished. The assets he used to operate it are being seized." Emma sat on the stool behind the counter with the phone to her ear. "What does that mean for the businesses he was taking money from?" she asked. "Some of them may have recovery options. It's complicated, but the operation is done." Andrea paused. "How are you doing?" "Better every day," Emma said, and meant it. She hung up and stood at the counter and thought about what done meant. It was a word she'd been working toward for weeks without letting herself believe she'd actually reach it. Done meant Derek Vaughn was not going to be in a parking lot behind her building, or a corner booth, or anywhere near this highway. Done meant the 43 documented incidents across 16 businesses were being folded into a formal criminal record. Done meant that all those business owners who'd spent 2 years being quietly bled were going to get not everything back. Nothing was ever fully back, but the air around them restored, the ability to breathe without calculating what it cost. She went to tell Jack. He was in the kitchen doing inventory. He had his reading glasses on, which he always pretended he didn't need, and always wore when he thought nobody was watching. She'd never said anything about it. She stood in the kitchen doorway. "He pled," she said. 7 counts. Jack wrote something on his inventory sheet. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," when he said. "That's it. Good." He looked up over his glasses. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know. Something bigger than good." He thought about that for a moment. "It's what was supposed to happen," he said. "The structure was built so that this was the logical conclusion." "A logical conclusion isn't a surprise." He set down his pen. "The thing I feel, if you want to know, is relief. Not about Derek, about you, about the fact that you can walk to your car now without checking the parking lot first." She looked at him. "I'm still going to check the parking lot." Old habits, he agreed. Was it worth it? She asked. What you agreed to? Whatever you gave up to bring those people and the women, Reno. The man with the gray beard, whatever the price was. Jack took off his reading glasses. He folded them carefully and put them in his shirt pocket. Some debts you pay with interest, he said. Some you pay clean. What I owe them, I've always owed. This just gave me a real reason to settle up. What do you owe them? He looked at the inventory sheet. A long time ago, he said. There were people in my life I let get hurt because I wasn't paying attention, because I was focused on the wrong things, the wrong kind of power. He paused. The people who came through that door, some of them are owed an apology I can't make directly. What I can do is make sure that when they needed me to be the person I should have been back then, I'm that person now. He looked up. It's not clean, nothing ever is, but it's something. She understood, in the way you understand things that are more felt than analyzed, that Jack Mitchell had spent years trying to figure out what a man does with a past that doesn't fully wash off, and that this, specifically this, the cafe and the highway, and Emma and Daniel Carter's invisible arrangement was the closest answer he'd found. My dad knew, she said, not a question. Your dad knew, Jack confirmed. She thought about Daniel Carter, the man who fixed things, setting up the last and most important repair of his life. Finding Jack and placing him here on this highway like a cornerstone, and then waiting and trusting and dying with the knowledge that the thing he'd built would hold. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a second. He was right to trust you, she said. Jack looked at her steadily. He was right to trust you, he said. I was just the part that was already in place when you arrived. 3 weeks after Derek Vaughn's plea, something happened that Emma hadn't anticipated. A reporter showed up. Not a major outlet, a woman named Sarah Pollock from a regional paper that covered the highway corridor, mid-30s, a digital recorder, a notebook, the specific energy of someone who'd been tipped to a story she could tell was real. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee and was upfront about who she was and what she was after. I've been talking to the business owners along this strip, Sarah said. 7 of them agreed to tell me what happened over the last 2 years. And every single one of them, when I asked how it ended, said the same thing. She looked at Emma. They said it ended because of the Desert Rose Café, because the owner here didn't pay and didn't leave. She paused. I'd like to understand what happened, and I'd like to know who Jack Mitchell is. Emma looked at the woman, at the recorder on the counter, at the notebook. She thought about Jack in his office, about the leather jacket on the filing cabinet, about the patches in the past, and the specific complicated truth of a man who had built something new, from something old, and was still figuring out what he owed and to whom. I'll ask him, Emma said. She went to the office. Jack was at his desk. She told him there was a reporter. She told him what Sarah Pollock had said, the 7 business owners, the same answer from all of them. He listened with his hands on the desk. What do you think? He asked. I think, Emma said carefully, that there's a story worth telling. I think there are 16 businesses along this highway who spent 2 years being frightened, and I think the people who helped end that deserve to have it be known that they helped end it. Not everything, not the parts that are yours to keep. She paused. But enough. Jack looked at the desk. Tell her I'll come out in 10 minutes, he said. Emma went back to the counter. He'll be out in 10 minutes, she told Sarah Pollock. Sarah wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. Can I ask you something first? Just you? Sure. Were you scared when it was happening? Emma thought about the parking lot and the cracked photograph and the math she'd run every night and the weight of the frame against her sternum in the dark. Yes, she said, every single day. But you didn't close. No. Why not? Emma considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Because my dad built me to hold on, she said, and because I had someone beside me who knew how. She paused. And because some things are worth more than the cost of holding on to them. This place, these people, this stretch of highway. She looked out the window at the road. Sometimes you just have to decide that it's yours and not let go. Sarah Pollock wrote that down. Jack came out of the office 8 minutes later. He'd taken off the leather jacket. He was in his regular clothes, the worn jeans, the clean shirt, the dish towel over one shoulder. He sat down at the counter with the reporter and folded his hands and said, What do you want to know? Emma moved to the other end of the counter and gave them space. She could hear fragments. Jack's careful voice, measured and precise, telling the shape of it without the deeper interior. The business owners. The evidence, the legal channels, the sheriff. He didn't mention the jacket or the patches. He didn't mention the people who'd come in that morning. He told the story as a story about a community pushing back, about documentation and cooperation and law enforcement doing its job when given what it needed to work with. All of which was true. All of which was also Emma understood exactly the right version to be on the record. The other version, the jacket and the specific silence of the men who'd come through the door, the two women who'd driven in and sat at the counter and spoken in the language of an old brotherhood, that version wasn't for the newspaper. That version was for people who already knew how to read it. Sarah Pollock stayed for an hour. She paid for her coffee. She left a card. After she'd gone, Jack sat at the counter for a moment with a second cup. Emma leaned on the counter across from him. "You told it right," she said. "I told the part that helps people," he said. "The rest is ours." She nodded. She reached for the coffee pot. She topped off his cup. "Jack," she said, "I've been thinking about the loan, the cafe." She steadied herself. "I want to buy you out, eventually. When the revenue is back to where it needs to be, and I can get a proper loan structure, I want this place to be mine for real. Not just my name on the debt, my name on everything." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "You've been thinking about this a while," he said. "Since the day you told me the loan was already in my name," she said. "Since I understood that he'd always planned for this to be mine. My dad. He arranged it so that if anything happened, I'd have a real claim on this place." She looked at the cafe, the counter, and the booths, and the window, and the highway beyond it. "He left me something after all. He just needed you to hold it until I was ready." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "When you're ready," he said, "we'll talk about the numbers. And in the meantime," he set down his cup, he picked up his dish towel. "In the meantime," he said, "there's a dinner rush coming, and the soup needs to be started." She looked at him, this old man, with his complicated past and his patient eyes, and his unfailing sense of exactly what the moment called for, and she thought my father knew exactly what he was doing. "Right," she said. She went to start the soup. Outside, the highway moved. Trucks and travelers, and the ordinary continuous traffic of people going somewhere, carrying their lives from one place toward the next, passing the desert Rose Café without knowing its name or its story and not needing to. The cafe held its ground beside the road. As it would, Sarah Pollock's article ran on a Thursday. Emma found out about it at 6:15 in the morning when Kenny Roach came through the door, holding his phone out in front of him like evidence before he'd even said hello. "You're in the paper," he said. She took the phone. The headline read, "Roadside Café stood its ground and took down a 2-year extortion ring with it." Below it, a photograph of the desert rose that Sarah must have taken from the parking lot on her way out, the sign, the highway behind it, the particular quality of western light that made everything look simultaneously ordinary and significant. Emma's name was in the third paragraph. Jack's name was in the first. She read it, standing at the counter with Kenny's phone while the coffee brewed. It was a good article. Sarah Pollock had done what good reporters do. She'd found the shape of the story beneath the events and written to that shape. The piece wasn't just about Derek Vaughn's arrest. It was about 16 businesses, 2 years of quiet terror, in the specific moment when one cafe on a forgotten stretch of Arizona highway decided that no was a complete sentence. She'd quoted 4 of the business owners by name. She'd quoted Sheriff Whitmore. She'd quoted Emma once, the thing Emma had said about her father building her to hold on, and the words looked different in print than they'd felt in the speaking of them, more solid, like something you could put your hand on. She'd quoted Jack once, "The law works when it has what it needs to work with. We gave it what it needed." Emma handed the phone back to Kenny. "Good article," Kenny said. "Yeah. You look like you're not sure how to feel about it." "I'm sure," Emma said. "I just need a minute to catch up." She poured his coffee. "Eggs? Always." By 8 o'clock, she understood that the article had moved faster than the cafe could contain. The phone started ringing at 7:40, not the regular orders and reservations calls, but people. A woman who owned a flower shop 40 miles north said she'd been under Derek's arrangement for 14 months, and she'd cried reading the article, and she wanted to know if she could come by and buy a cup of coffee because she needed to see the place with her own eyes. A man who identified himself only as a truck driver who worked this route said he was going to tell every driver he knew to stop at the Desert Rose from now on. And that was not a small number of people. A retired couple from Phoenix said they drove the highway twice a month to visit their daughter in Tucson, and they'd always driven past the cafe without stopping, and now they felt personally offended by that and were going to fix it immediately. Emma wrote none of this down. She just listened and thanked people and said, "Yes, come in please," and hung up and answered the next call. Jack stood at the other end of the counter drinking his coffee and watching her with an expression she couldn't read from across the room. When the calls thinned out about around 8:30, he walked over. "How many?" he asked. "I stopped counting at 11. He nodded slowly. "Are you okay with this?" he asked. The attention. She thought about it. "Ask me again in a week," she said. "Right now, I'm mostly just trying to keep up." He nodded again. He picked up the coffee pot and started making the rounds himself the way he'd done the morning after the arrest, without announcement, without making it a moment, just doing what needed to be done because more people were coming through the door than usual, and two sets of hands were better than one. By 11 o'clock, the parking lot was full, not just with regular customers, with strangers. People who'd read the article or had it forwarded to them or heard it from someone who'd read it. People who'd driven specific distances to be here. People who were from the highway and people who weren't. Emma moved through the room at a pace she hadn't maintained in months, taking orders and pouring coffee and answering the occasional question from someone who wanted to know which table the man had sat at, where exactly everything had happened, what it had felt like in the room. She answered those questions briefly and honestly and moved on because there were 15 other people who needed coffee and the lunch rush was building, and Jack was working the far side of the room with a dish towel over his shoulder, and the quiet efficiency she'd watched for 5 years and now understood was not just habit, but something older, something trained in environments where inefficiency had actual consequences. The flower shop woman arrived at noon. Her name was Patricia Huang. She was 58. She had close-cropped hair and a posture that suggested she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and was only now beginning to set it down. She sat at the counter and ordered a grilled cheese and a coffee and looked around the room. "It looks normal," she said when Emma came back with her order. "It is normal," Emma said. "I mean, it looks like a regular cafe." Patricia looked at the counter, the windows, the far wall. "I don't know what I expected, something more dramatic." "It's a diner," Emma said. "The drama was renting space. This is what it looks like when the lease runs out." Patricia looked at her. Then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that comes when something is funnier and more perfect than expected. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Your father raised you right," she said. Emma paused. "Did you know my dad?" "I knew of him. He delivered to my shop for 2 years before he got sick." Patricia wrapped both hands around her coffee. "He used to leave a flower from my display on the truck step when he made a delivery. Never said anything about it. Just left it." She looked at her cup. "I put it in water every time." Never told him that either. Emma stood very still at the counter. Patricia looked up. "I'm sorry, is that too much?" "No," Emma said. Her voice was steady. "No, that's thank you. I needed that." She went to the kitchen and stood at the prep table for 60 seconds and breathed. Then she went back out. Jack disappeared from the floor around 1:30. She noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of something that's been a constant, not immediately, but in the accumulation of small moments where you expect a thing and it isn't there. She'd turned to say something to him twice and found empty space and then registered that she'd been doing that and looked around the room and he wasn't on the floor. His office door was closed. Not unusual, but given the volume of the day, given that the room was still 90% full at 1:30, given that he'd been working alongside her all morning, the closed door had a different quality to it than usual. She knocked between taking orders. "I'm fine," he said through the door. "I need an hour." She went back to work. He emerged at 2:45. The lunch rush had peaked and was thinning. His face was composed in the usual way, but she could see she'd learned to see the particular quality of a man who had been doing something emotionally significant in private and was now re-engaging with the public version of himself. He came behind the counter and refilled his coffee and stood beside her. "You okay?" she asked quietly between customers. "Yes," a pause. "I was on the phone." "Anyone I know?" He looked at the counter for a moment. "My daughter," he said. Emma turned to look at him full. She had not known he had a daughter. In 5 years, he had never mentioned a daughter. He had mentioned very little about family at all. She'd assumed in the way you assume things about private people. that the absence of mention meant the absence of the thing. You have a daughter, she said. I do, he said. She's 34. She lives in Oregon. He picked up the coffee cup. We haven't spoken in 6 years. Emma waited. She read the article, he said. Her husband showed it to her. She recognized my name. Jack. She kept her voice even. What did she say? It was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, she said she was glad I'd found something worth protecting. He set down the cup, and then asked if she could call me again sometime. His voice was completely controlled and completely full, at the same time the specific sound of a man holding something very carefully because he knows how fragile it is. I said yes. Emma looked at him, at this man who had paid his debts in every direction he could find, who had laid down every piece of his past he could get his hands on and built something new from the material that remained, and who had just from an article in a regional paper about a roadside cafe been handed the thing he'd probably stopped letting himself want. Jack, she said. Don't, he said. I'm not going to say anything. Good. I'm just going to stand here for a second. That's fine, he said. They stood at the counter together in the middle of the afternoon rush and didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. The week that followed the article was the busiest the Desert Rose had seen since Emma could remember possibly ever. She didn't have the historical records to compare, but Jack told her on Wednesday that the revenue for the week was going to exceed the previous monthly record, which she initially misheard as weekly record, and when he corrected her, she had to sit down for a moment. Monthly, she said. Monthly, he confirmed. In a week. People travel, he said, and when they have a reason to go somewhere specific, they go. She was good at managing it. Better than she'd expected to be, she found under the pressure of the volume a version of herself that she recognized as her father's daughter in a specific way. The organizational instinct, the ability to triage and prioritize without freezing, the particular quality of calm that isn't the absence of stress, but the management of it, the holding of it in one hand while the other hand keeps working. She hired 2 part-time staff in the second week. She'd been meaning to do it for months, but the revenue hadn't supported it. Now it did. She found them through a bulletin board at the community college 30 miles north, a 20-year-old named Marcus who had never worked in a kitchen, but learned with a speed that reminded her of herself at that age, and a 55-year-old retired nurse named Gloria, who had worked exactly one shift when Emma understood she'd accidentally hired someone who was more competent at running a dining room than Emma herself. She told Jack this. Good, he said. That means you can think about the other things. What other things? He looked at her over his reading glasses. The things you've been postponing because you've been in survival mode for 4 years. She started to say she hadn't been in survival mode and stopped because it wasn't true. She'd been in survival mode since her mother died. She'd shifted into a higher gear of it when her father got sick, and a higher gear still when he died, and the Derek situation had pushed it to a register she didn't have a name for, and now the pressure was off. The bills were being paid. The cafe was more than solvent. She had 2 employees and a legal case moving through the system, and a full parking lot 5 days a week. She didn't know what to do with the absence of emergency. She told Jack this on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that the last several months had not contained just the 2 of them, and the coffee and the thin breakfast crowd and the highway moving in its usual way outside. That's normal, he said. It doesn't feel normal. It feels like waiting for the next thing. That's also normal, he said. Your nervous system is still running the old program. Give it time. How long did it take you when you left your old life and started this? He thought about it. 2 years before I stopped checking over my shoulder automatically, he said. 3 before I stopped waking up at 4 in the morning. He paused. 4 before I made the cafe what I actually wanted it to be instead of just a place to be. 4 years. I'm a slow learner, he said. You're faster. She poured more coffee. Jack, I want to talk about the buyout. He set down his cup. The revenue is there, she said. Not all of it. I'd need a loan for part of it, which I can get now that the cafe has 3 solid months of real earnings documented. But the structure is there. She steadied herself. I want to do this before something else happens, while the moment is right. He looked at her steadily. I've been thinking about it too, he said. And I think you're right. The timing is right. He folded his hands on the counter. I want to talk about the structure of it, though, not just the numbers. What structure? He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how to say something he'd already decided to say. I don't want full separation, he said. I want to stay on in some capacity, not as owner as whatever you need me to be. Staff consultant, the guy who opens on Tuesdays. I don't care about the title. He looked at the cafe around him. This place is what I am now. I'd like to remain part of what it is. Emma looked at him. She felt something move in her chest, not surprise exactly, but the confirmation of something she'd known without letting herself count on. I wasn't going to ask you to leave, she said. I know, I'm asking you to formally let me stay. Jack, she held his gaze. You're not an employee. You're not a consultant. You're the guy who watched over me for 5 years because my dad asked you to and turned into something more than that without either of us planning it. She paused. Your family. You stay because you're family. The paperwork can say whatever it needs to say. He looked at the counter for a long moment. She watched him hold the word family the way you hold something you've been careful not to want in case it wasn't available. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They shook on it formally across the counter because Jack Mitchell was the kind of man who marked things that mattered with a concrete gesture, even when the gesture was small. Then he picked up his dish towel and went back to work. The letter arrived on a Friday, not a business letter, a personal one, handwritten addressed to Emma Carter in care of the Desert Rose Café, postmarked Phoenix. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it at the counter between the breakfast and lunch shift, standing up because she hadn't sat down for 6 hours and force of habit had made her forget that sitting was an option. It was from Daniel Carter's hospital. Not the billing department, a different department, a patient liaison whose name Emma didn't recognize, who wrote that the remaining balance on Daniel Carter's account had been satisfied in full by an anonymous payment made 10 days prior. The account was closed. Emma owed nothing. She read it twice. She turned the letter over looking for something that wasn't there, a name, a note, any indication of origin. Nothing. She went to Jack's office. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in. She put the letter on the desk in front of him without saying anything. He read it. His expression didn't change. Did you do this? She asked. He looked at her. No. Then who? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter again. When did the payment come in? He asked. 10 days ago. That's the same week as the article. He was quiet again. She watched him think. Reno, he said finally. Reno paid my father's hospital bill. Or arranged it, Jack said. It's the kind of thing, he stopped, started again. It's the kind of thing that happens in that world when someone decides that a debt has been incurred. Not your debt, mine. They decided I was owed something and they found a way to pay it. He looked at the letter. Through you. He looked at Emma sat in the chair against the wall. She looked at the letter in his hands. She thought about her father's remaining bill, the number she'd been carrying for months, the weight of it, the specific way it had sat behind every other calculation she'd made. Gone. Settled. By men she'd never met through a network she couldn't fully see because of a jacket on a wall and a name that still moved in certain rooms. That world, she said slowly, the one you came from, it's not as gone as you think, is it? Jack set down the letter carefully. No, he said, it's not. And some parts of it I've made peace with keeping. He looked at her. The parts that can be aimed at the right things, the loyalty, the willingness to act when something's wrong. Those parts, I didn't leave those behind. I redirected them. She looked at the letter on the desk. I don't know how to feel about this, she said. That's honest, he said. You don't have to feel one thing about it. It can be complicated. The money is real. The money is real, he agreed, and your father's account is closed. And that's true regardless of the path it took to get there. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about paths, about the complicated, indirect, sometimes barely visible paths that certain kinds of care travel to reach the people they're meant to reach. Her father arranging Jack, Jack arranging evidence, a network of people moving because one name still carried weight. All of it arriving here to this letter on this desk on this Friday morning. Okay, she said. Okay. It's complicated, she said. And the money is real. And my dad would have laughed about this for about 30 seconds and then gotten very quiet because it would have meant something to him that he couldn't put into words. She paused. Same as me. She picked up the letter. She folded it back into its envelope. She put it in her jacket pocket next to the silver necklace with the desert flower pendant that she wore every day. The day she signed the papers was a Wednesday in December, 8 weeks after the article ran. The attorney's office was in town, 20 miles from the cafe, and she drove herself in the truck she'd bought the previous month, used reliable, a pale blue Ford that had belonged to a retired electrician who'd maintained it impeccably and let it go at a fair price. She'd bought it with 3 months solid revenue behind her and the specific feeling of a person who is building something durable rather than managing something fragile. Jack rode with her. He'd offered to stay back and open the cafe, and she'd looked at him and said, "You're coming," in a tone that wasn't a request, and he'd put on his jacket and gotten in the truck without further discussion. The attorney was a woman named Claire Boland, who handled small business transfers and had done, she said, about 40 of them over 20 years. She reviewed the documents with them, both asked the right questions, confirmed that the loan restructure was clean, and the terms were what Emma had negotiated. She had Emma sign in 7 places and Jack sign in 4, and at the end of it, she stamped the final page and looked up. "Congratulations," she said, "you own a cafe." Emma looked at the stamped document. At her name on the top line, owner of record, the Desert Rose Cafe, Highway 93, Arizona. She didn't cry. She'd seen this coming long enough that the moment of arrival was more quiet than overwhelming, the feeling of something clicking into place, rather than something suddenly granted. But she felt it fully and without reservation, the specific weight of a thing becoming truly legally permanently hers. She looked at Jack in the chair beside her. "I was looking at the document. You okay?" she asked. "Very," he said. His voice was steady and full in the same way it had been when he'd told her about his daughter's phone call. The holding something carefully voice. "Thank you," she said. "Don't. Jack. Emma. I'm going to say it," she said. "Thank you for being here when he asked you to be, and for being more than that when it mattered, and for staying." She held his gaze. "My dad made a good call." He looked at her for a long moment. "The best he ever made," he said, "was you." She pressed her lips together, nodded once, looked at the document. They drove back to the cafe in the pale December light, not talking much. The highway running ahead of them, familiar and ordinary, and entirely theirs. She put the signed copy of the paperwork in the top drawer of the office desk, the desk that was now formally hers, and she put next to it a photograph. Not the cracked one Derek had dropped on the parking lot concrete. That one she'd had reframed new glass, and it was behind the counter where it had always been. This was a different photograph, a new one taken 3 weeks prior by Kenny Roach on his phone and printed at a drugstore. It showed Emma and Jack behind the counter at the Desert Rose. They weren't posed. Kenny had just taken it, the two of them. Mid-morning, Jack with the coffee pot and Emma with her order pad, both of them in motion, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the drawer. She went out to the floor. It was mid-morning. The cafe was doing what the cafe did, moving, filling, making its particular sounds. Gloria had the far tables, and Marcus was running the kitchen, and Kenny Roach was in his usual spot with his usual eggs and his 4th cup of coffee, and the highway outside was moving the way highways move, continuous and indifferent and full of people going somewhere. Jack was behind the counter. He looked up when she came through. She picked up the coffee pot. She started making rounds. 2 months later, Jack's daughter came to visit. Her name was Caroline, and she had her father's eyes and a careful way of moving that suggested she'd grown up around people who paid attention to rooms, and she sat at the counter for 2 hours on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and talking to Emma, while Jack pretended to do inventory in the kitchen because he didn't trust himself to sit still through a conversation that mattered that much. Emma told Caroline nothing she didn't have a right to know and everything she needed to hear. She told her that her father had spent 11 years building something good on this highway, and that the building had been deliberate and that the goodness was not an accident. She told her that Jack Mitchell was a man who had done some things wrong and had spent a very long time doing things right instead, and that in her experience, the doing right was real and not performance. Caroline listened. When Jack finally came out of the kitchen, pretending he'd finished the inventory, pretending he was just happening to come to the counter, Caroline stood up from her stool. She didn't say anything for a moment. Jack looked at his daughter across the counter of his cafe with the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for 6 years and has just been shown a place to set it down. "Hi, Dad," she said. He came around the counter. He put his arms around her. Emma picked up the coffee pot and gave them the room. She made her rounds. She took orders. She refilled Kenny Roach's cup. She checked on the two truckers by the window, and the retired couple who'd driven from Phoenix on their way to Tucson, and the young woman in the corner booth who was working on a laptop and had been nursing the same cup of coffee for 90 minutes, and who Emma had decided was a writer. She moved through the room that was hers fully, legally, completely hers, and felt the truth of what it meant to own something, not just in the document sense, but in the bone-deep sense, the sense that comes from having held it when it was hard to hold and having refused to let go. Her father had taught her that, not with words, with the entire shape of his life. She was still teaching herself what she'd learned from him. She figured she had time. The highway ran, the cafe held. Jack and his daughter sat at the counter and talked in low voices and started the long and perfect work of finding their way back to each other. And Emma Carter moved through the room with her coffee pot and her father's necklace against her skin and the deed to her cafe in the top drawer of her desk. And she thought, this is what it looks like when things go right. Not perfect, not without calm, not without the weight of everything it took to get here. But right, real and hers. That was enough. That was everything. That was the whole truth of it, and it held the way the best things hold without needing another word.